Welcome and thank you for joining us for Brown War Watch in discussion with Dr. Stephanie Savell, Senior Researcher and Co-Director of the Kosovo War Program at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs here at Brown University. For those less familiar with our group, Brown War Watch, we are the student anti-war and peace activist group here on the Brown campus. Working for peace since 2017, we meet weekly throughout the semester and welcome all political persuasions and religious beliefs united by the quest to build a more peaceful world, dismantle the profligate war machine, and raise awareness about conflicts around the globe and the rising tension between the world's superpowers. We're particularly focused on the intersection of militarism and other injustices, especially racial, economic, and environmental. You can follow our work at brownwarwatch.com and on social media, or email us at brownwarwatch@brown.edu to join the effort. Dr. Stephanie Savell is an anthropologist of militarism, security, and civic engagement in the US and Brazil. She has published in a number of peer-reviewed academic journals, as well as writing for and appearing regularly on popular media outlets. Dr. Savell joins us to discuss the ongoing and devastating war on terror in Africa, focusing on the Sahel in general and Burkina Faso specifically, where she's recently completed field research. By design, Africa falls out of the courage on the global war on terror. So we're excited and honored for Dr. Savell to join us and shed light on these conflicts. So the plan today is for Dr. Savell to deliver a short presentation before a Q&A session to round out the hour. To that end, if the presentation inspires a question, please do not hesitate to submit it through the chat function, and we look forward to addressing them and the robust discussion that follows. Welcome, Dr. Savell.
Thanks so much. And thanks to all of you for your interest, for being here tonight. And I'm sorry I had to reschedule a couple of times. My household was kind of racked by this monster virus that was not COVID, but my little one had pneumonia and we were all out for the count for a while. So
no, we're just happy that you're all on the mend. It's good to hear.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks. Anyway, thanks for your flexibility. So I'm going to just dive right in because
please, yes.
Such a great intro. Yeah. Here, hold on. Let's see. Can you see my slideshow here?
We can indeed.
Yes. We do.
Okay, great.
Bravo.
So I'm just going to present to you a paper that I published in March of this year based on this trip to Burkina Faso. This is an ongoing project. So I'm happy to talk to you more about how it's continued since then, how I see it moving forward. But basically, it is positioning what's going on in the Sahel as an extension of this, quote unquote, global war on terror, the post 9/11 wars, as we call them. And the origins of the conflict in the Sahel are incredibly complex. There are multiple parties responsible for the violence, and the U.S. plays a relatively minor role, actually, in the conflict and the violence. So, my paper is looking at the U.S. role, but it's not saying that the U.S. is kind of the primary actor. But it's really important to look at the U.S. role in particular in this conflict. And it shows that the paper shows that this has been the U.S. role has been a factor in shaping what's going on the ground there, and hardly anyone. No media sources especially are kind of making the connection to the U.S. war on terror and what's going on in West Africa. So basically, I think it's important to kind of step back and understand that a war paradigm approach to the problem of terrorism is not a natural or inevitable kind of a approach. And this is a research by the RAND Corporation that shows 268 cases, 1968 to 2006, different ways that governments have ended this terrorist violence, so-called terrorist violence. Intelligence and policing, 40% successful, peaceful political accommodation, 43%, 10% group achieved its objectives by violence and seized its activity, and only 7% by military defeat. And yet what the US is doing in Burkina Faso and many other countries is setting governments up to respond to the problem of terrorism with their own domestic wars on terror. We're doing that, it's a narrative, and it's also a set of political, institutional, economic supports like training, weapons sales, and lots of funding. So here's the region that I'm talking about, and you can see a bunch of the violent incidents involving what they use the term jihadism in the region. They speak French, and they call it jihadism. And you can see all the kind of violent attacks in the past few years, and what a kind of hotspot this has been in the Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger region, tri-border region. Oh, just a quick note that my methods, I did some firsthand interviews in Burkina Faso's capital, Ouagadougou. And this was in January 2020. I was talking to displaced people, journalists, activists, scholars, former government officials, nonprofit staff. And I've also done a lot of secondary research with academic articles, think tank analyses, and nonprofit analyses, as well as media. So this map is something that you may have seen. I've put it together for the past few years, and it shows all the places in the world that the US is involved in some sort of counterterrorism operation, 85 countries. And what I was really struck with on this map was in part like how many data points there are in Africa, and how, outside the Middle East, it's really the region where there is some of the most US counterterror activity, and yet the US public knows very little about it. So that was one of the things that motivated me to do this deep dive into Burkina Faso. And I think, so the yellow dots there are security assistance. Some, like the red is, drone strikes and things that are kind of more obviously violent. Security assistance sounds so innocuous. It sounds like a kind of a, neighborly help for these foreign partners, right? And my work shows that it's anything but. So this gives you a little bit of a snapshot of the conflict in Burkina Faso. You can see the fatalities shot up in 2019, 2020, and the region you can see right up. This is the map of the country. It's right up there in the north, along that tri-border region. Here's the human toll, and these numbers are very likely an underestimate. It's really hard to get an accurate count on these things. But this is the scale, over 2,000 people killed. And there you can see it's kind of broken up, like who's been killed by the militants and by government forces and government-backed militias. Internally displaced people, over 1 million. Lots of children lacking access to school, 3 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. So it's just becoming this kind of humanitarian crisis of really, really dramatic proportions. Okay, so just to back up and give you a little bit of the history. After 9/11, the US quickly began expanding its footprint across Africa, the logic being to extend counterterror activity to ungoverned spaces where these Islamist groups could potentially gain a foothold and thus threaten US interests. And this is very much along the lines of what, President Bush, when he began the war on terror, was talking about, a preventative, preemptive war approach. The US hasn't always followed this strategy, but this was something that was pushed by a very particular group within Bush's administration, and that has been carried forth by the successive presidential administrations ever since this preventative war approach, like we're going to go get the terrorists before they get us, kind of thing. So at the time, the U.S. security strategists didn't see much of a threat in Africa, and there was some kind of activity in Somalia. But nonetheless, they began to train rapid response military units from Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger as early as 2003. And very quickly, the US personnel began to describe it not as a training program, but as a means of tracking down suspected terrorists, especially those affiliated with an Algerian group with links to al-Qaeda, the predecessor of what would later become al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. Then in 2005, this Pan-Sahel initiative that the US was doing this counterterror activity in the Sahel became the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership that continues today. And Burkina Faso was added to the TSTCP in 2009, despite the fact that US officials at the time identified no terrorist threat there. The assessment was there's very little threat of jihadist activity. So why the Sahel? Scholars have posited different reasons that the U.S. may have been there, may have had an interest in being there. One, and I think this really is a big motivator still today, is maintaining this geopolitical presence to counter the influence of Russia and China. The U.S. is often competing. It really is like a kind of a new Cold War scenario in Africa these days, where the U.S. is competing with these other great powers to be the kind of military partner of choice of many of these African countries. There are a lot of natural resources, so scholars have suggested that's part of the U.S. interest in the region. Certainly, local people will say that the French, that's a big motivator for their former colonial power. And I think it's really important to call attention to this, the centuries-old kind of racialized logics of the U.S. relations with Africa, and this President Bush saying he wanted the U.S. military to be ready to strike at any moment's notice in any dark corner of the world, and those were his words: any dark corner of the world. So let's see, the TSTCP has, in theory, a holistic approach to counterterrorism, including development and public diplomacy. But in practice, rather than attempting to address any of the fundamental structural challenges like poverty that drive instability in the region, U.S. officials really focus on training elite counterterrorism units as the most cost-effective way of conducting what they call a vital, limited effort to counter local al-Qaeda affiliates and now ISIS. So here you can see the dramatic rise of U.S. security assistance to Burkina Faso since it entered the TSTCP in 2009, when the conflict in neighboring, I see. Yeah, there's especially big spikes after 2012, when the conflict in neighboring Mali broke out. And I'll tell you a bit about that history in a moment. But you can see the corresponding rise with Burkina Faso's military expenditures over that same time period. So you see the US military investment, and then you see Burkina Faso's, here we go. Burkina Faso's military expenditures are rising at the same time. So you can kind of track that flow of money there. So you kind of see what I'm talking about in terms of the US government setting Burkina Faso up for this war paradigm approach to the problem of terrorism. And very briefly, the history of this conflict. In 2011, a US and NATO-backed revolution in Libya toppled longtime Libyan dictator Colonel Gaddafi, and the regime's weapons arsenals were looted by various Libyan rebel groups. These rebel groups had ties to the separatist Tuareg movements and Islamist militants based in Mali. So Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb that I mentioned, and its splinter groups. And those militants soon gained the upper hand over the Tuareg separatists. The international community was concerned that the conflict would spill over into the surrounding region, as indeed it has. And France launched Operation Serval in 2012. The UN began an Operation MINUSMA in 2013. In 2014, Serval became Operation Barkhane, the French Operation Barkhane, which continues today. And France has taken the lead, but there are an estimated 20,000 soldiers from Europe, the UN, including other African nations, and the US in Mali in the region. And the US has provided critical support throughout all this to France's combat operations by airlifting soldiers and supplies, flying refueling missions, and providing drone signal and satellite intelligence. So a representative at the French embassy in Burkina Faso told me, without American surveillance operations, Barkhane, the French operation, would not be able to operate. It's absolutely essential. So how has Burkina Faso used its own domestic war on terror? There are a few things I'm going to talk about. The first is to repress the Fulani. And this is a herding ethnic group. They have been Muslim for centuries, since long before colonial times. And they're a group that a lot of other ethnic groups tend to view with they're just kind of discriminated against. They're traditionally nomadic, and the central government in Burkina Faso is dominated by the Mossi, which is the country's majority ethnic group. And the tension between the Mossi group and the Fulani minority is a reverberation of the colonial era. During that time, France instituted what they called a politique des races to facilitate the system of indirect rule. And the French named certain ethnic groups state leaders while denigrating others as tribes. So the Fulani, along with other minority groups, have long felt discriminated against and marginalized by a government that does not feel their own. And an army communications officer told me in an interview, it's not that all Peul, that's what they call the Fulani in French, it's not that all Fulani are terrorists, it's that most terrorists are Fulani. This is what he told me as a justification for why the army was, the country is pursuing this ethnic group. And so the country's armed forces, they have extrajudicially executed up to 1,000 civilians, probably more as of this writing. And it's really difficult to confirm such cases once again. So just taking a step back, there's an anthropologist named Akbar Ahmed who looked at the effects of US counterterrorism in about 40 countries throughout the Islamic world. And he basically shows how many countries have used US training and assistance to consolidate power over marginalized tribal groups. And this has worsened these kinds of ethnic conflicts, many of which have predated 9/11. So for generations, central governments have carried out harsh assimilation policies to civilize tribes, including massacre, forced relocation, systematic rape, and banning local languages in the press and in schools. Just as one example, in the 1970s, the Malian government dealt with Tuareg rebellions by capturing and killing Tuareg leaders and targeting these herders by poisoning their wells that are in the middle of desolate stretches of the Sahara Desert. So this is this is something that's happening in many other places. And this is a photo here of the Yirgu massacre, which is a touchstone for many people in Burkina Faso about when the current conflict really got started in a serious way. And what happened was there was a massacre of Fulani males, including boys and elderly men, in and around this town, a bunch of hamlets. And there were these local militia groups called the Kogliogo, consisting largely of Mossi men, that mobilized in retaliation for the murder of a Mossi chief by men they accused of being jihadists. And over the course of several days, these Kogliogo killed up to 220 Fulani men. And President Kabore, the current president of Burkina Faso, he failed to condemn the atrocity, and even went so far later on as to congratulate some of the men who had been involved in the massacre. And the government has now implemented a deliberate policy of arming these Kogliogo militia groups around the country to fight terrorists. By some estimates, there are over 92,000 armed men in Kogliogo militias today in the country. And meanwhile, Islamist militants are targeting villages of all ethnic groups, including the Fulani, with violent attacks and attempts to assert control. So Fulani interviewees told me that they feel caught between two fires. They're vulnerable to the Kogliogo and the government security forces, and they're also vulnerable to the attack by militant groups. This is a slide that shows, who's doing the killing. So if you look at the blue, that's the civilian fatalities that were committed by state security forces. The green is these militant groups, and the pink is these militia groups, and then white is unidentified. So you can really see how in many cases the state security forces are actually killing more people than these so-called jihadist groups. I just want to add a couple of layers of complexity here before I wrap up. So there's a lot at stake in what's going on and what I'm kind of describing with broad brushstrokes. There's like tension between different livelihood groups. There was one interviewee, he told me the story of how during a long drought, and again, this is one of the regions that has been most extremely affected so far by climate change, right? And desertification and drought. A Fulani man, this interviewee told me about a Fulani man who traveled with his herd for several years. And as is often done, he allowed a man of a different ethnic group to borrow his plot of land to farm while he was gone. And when the herder finally returned, he found the farmer had taken over much more of his land than originally they had agreed on. And shortly afterwards, the herder was apprehended and later killed by state security forces. So the interviewee, in telling me this story, suspected that the farmer had found an expedient way to take over this land by accusing the herder of being a jihadist. Another layer of complexity is that government and Western-led, donor-led development interventions have privileged sedentary modes of life, such as those of the Mossi farmers, over nomadic ones, such as the Fulani. And again, there's this desertification and climate change have increasingly threatened the livelihoods of pastoralist groups like the Fulani, forcing them further afield in search of adequate grazing for their herds and raising all this tension over land use. So it's into such intricate sets of historical, political, cultural, and environmental relations between central governments and minority ethnic groups dating back to colonialism, between state-sanctioned self-defense militias and their targets, between unequal neighbors, among others, that the US inserts its post-9/11 understandings and resources. So the case of Burkina Faso and its treatment of the Fulani shows how local power dynamics are mobilized and enmeshed in counterterrorism. And these dynamics are far more complex than a logic that categorically posits that a good state combats evil terrorists. Once introduced into local contexts, which vary by country but are uniformly complex, counterterrorism takes on a life of its own. Deployed by governments who use it to target and repress minority groups, it has enormous human and societal costs. And U.S. security assistance is therefore complicit in exacerbating the government violations that inflame intercommunal conflict on a massive scale. So I'm going to end there with just a quick summary of these last points, which are that the Burkina Faso's government has also used its own war on terror to justify undemocratic governance. There's been a huge crackdown on freedom of the press and a real lack of transparency. There were a lot of people talking about how the elite were profiting off of this huge war machine, and the West African militaries are really known for having a huge discrepancy between, junior personnel and senior level officials. And there's been mutinies and things like that. So there's really this history of corruption. And basically the point of a lot of the blowback point is that this is one of the biggest reasons that people are talking about why these militant groups are growing in this region, is because it's a response in part to the government crackdown, government repression of these groups. And, the biggest, like I heard someone say, like 80% of people who join these militant groups are doing so because government forces killed one of their family members or friends, and this is something, they're doing this for revenge. There's also lots of other reasons, like poverty and frustration at elite corruption and abandonment by the state. It's incredibly complex, but certainly this kind of response to government violence, which has been aided and abetted by the United States, is a big reason. So I will end there and open it up for questions.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Dr. Savell. That was brilliant. That was detailed and very rich. I might, while we open it to questions, I was very interested in this notion of war paradigm and the way in which the arming and training and exacerbating of war fuels further conflict and perhaps leads to an unstable and unproductive economy where in fact war is the only game in town, and then you get reprisals. And really interested to hear that you started with the fallout from Libya and the troops that were trained and armed there who have moved down, because I think that is similar to the story in Chad and Mali next door. Similar groups have been trained there. The other dynamic I think that I found particularly compelling is that when you destabilize that economy and make war the only game in town, you get a generation of young men who their only skills is as soldiering, and the ebb and flows of those wars, they need to find work in a non-functioning economy. So then they fuel the mercenary forces of the superpowers. And so they move into in military roles in the Middle East and across, places where they're cheap. They become cheap.
Right. I think a lot of it is like so much more local than that. It's there's been studies of men who engage in violence in West Africa, and showing that basically a lot of these these men are cycling between different jobs, like depending on the time of the year, right? So they're going and they're farming what they can during a certain time, and then they're taking up weapons at another time of year, and it's a very kind of a fluid way of it's basically a type of work, a type of labor, but a lot of these men, I would say, are not necessarily so sophisticated that they're then traveling anywhere. There is that component to what's going on in West Africa, in that some of these militant groups are pretty sophisticated. There's lots of money from smuggling of different things. And there was a lot of talk when I was in Burkina Faso about how they're creating like a smuggling corridor, that's the kind of one of their goals. And a lot of people saying, like, really kind of equating some of these, saying, oh, the Islamist militant thing, that it's really just kind of a cloak over this really kind of illicit profiteering interests that have existed for forever, and now they're calling themselves militants and things like that. So there is a little bit of like global circulation and a lot of very local kind of scrabbling to get by.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, we have a question here of Babak.
Thank you so much. This was very informative and heartbreaking at the same time, and also all too familiar. I feel like this keeps happening in country after country. I was wondering how much you got the sense in your interviews that the support of great powers of the world are used as a source of legitimacy for the government. So instead of the government saying, well, I'm democratic, or I represent all of the people in this region, the fact that these great powers of the world are supporting them, that is used as a source of legitimacy, which then emboldens them to much more openly just massacre these groups and create this cycle of violence.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's true. I think that the U.S. Hasn't done enough to hold those governments accountable for these grave human rights violations. There's been outcry from Human Rights Watch and a couple of other human rights groups, but it does seem like they're kind of acting with impunity in a lot of cases. And I spoke with I did an interview of a Cameroonian official who was telling me that they're very, very skilled at using the different resources from these different countries. So like if a unit gets blacklisted by the Leahy law, which is the US's, it's a US law that the military can't train a unit from another country that's been documented as being involved in human rights abuses. And so the US will say, oh, we can't work with this unit. There's all kinds of ways of getting around the Leahy law, but then apparently this official was telling me, then the Chinese, step up the next day and are like, hey, heard it's not going so well with the Americans. Like he was very candid in his description of how each foreign power had like a different something to offer, and the Chinese would come with their like Amazon like book full of weapons that they could choose from. But the thing that makes the US stand out in terms of all the different kind of foreign powers is just the sheer scale of the resources that are involved and the like massive amounts of money that are at stake, right? So that's money confers legitimacy and power, and all those weapons sales and all that kind of stuff. Absolutely.
Alberto, please.
Hello, thank you so much for such an amazing talk. And I had a couple of questions. I mean, you certainly alluded to all the or influence that the US has had in these places, and it's sadly, but also unsurprising. But what about, is there any other uh, like US allies in the region? I know, for example, France had a big influence over this region for, many, many decades. Is there something to the sort that's going on aside, of course, of the local government, that another player, if you say?
Yeah, no, I mean, you can't, that's kind of what I was saying at the very beginning, which is you can't even begin to think that the US is like the most important foreign player in the region. France certainly wins the prize for that one in West Africa, at least. It's the former colonial power. There's just the politics of West African countries are really enmeshed with French interests. There's a lot of kind of post-colonial politics that are at play, and so it's kind of funny because I mean, people on the ground, they'll say most people didn't even know that the US has any programs there. If they're seeing foreign soldiers, they're seeing French soldiers. So there's France, but then it sounds to me like it's just kind of exploded. And this is where the kind of new Cold War comment that I made comes from. There's just like all kinds of foreign governments that are kind of getting involved. There are Russian mercenaries that are, that people are saying were probably involved in what happened in Chad with the killing of the president, and there are, as I said, there's Chinese involvement, but there's also, I can't say with any specificity, but I want to say like the Dutch and the Qataris, and just like a lot of different foreign governments are involved for one reason or another. I still have to sort out why. And it's really, really puzzling and disturbing to think of a kind of a new Cold War type situation in Africa. It's like, God, haven't we done there? Haven't we been there? Like this, hasn't this been disastrous already?
Yeah.
A brief follow-up on the French question. I recall only months before our own announcement of the withdrawal from Afghanistan that Macron made a big fanfare of this concept of withdrawal from the Sahel. And I'm wondering if this sort of withdrawal of the French withdrawal sense of withdrawal from the region is in a way mirrors our similar use of that term, where it may be that we withdraw troops on the ground, but there's an intensification of surveillance networks and drone warfare and things like that. Is that something that the French might be undertaking too?
I think that's my sense of it. I don't know enough to answer for sure, but that's my sense of what's going on. And certainly I can say that, Macron is kind of pulling French troops out of West Africa for some of the same reasons that Biden has here, which is that it's like, unpopular with the French population. So they don't want French forces dying in those wars over there. There's a lot of French interest in kind of maintaining quote unquote stability in the region, but a lot of times the problem is that if the French are kind of aiding these governments that are perpetrating these abuses, then they're not exactly promoting stability. So, I think that the French have really, taken a lot of cues from the US narrative of the war on terror. So it is going to be interesting to follow, how that shifts kind of in parallel with our official but troop withdrawal from Afghanistan that is, as you say, a continuation of the post 9/11 wars in a different form.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if part of that withdrawal of the French is driven by that flare up in racism and populism, that they don't want to be seen to have broken something and then have to take the responsibility for the war refugees because of the schisms that are opening within French society because of its relationship to Africa. So that might also.
Well, yeah, I mean, and there are scholars who say that, you know, the reason that the French are involved and other European powers in the kind of securitization of Africa is precisely because they want to put, you know, kind of reduce the immigration flow. So,
Alberto, you have a follow-up.
Yes, always. I always have follow-up. So, you know, you paint this picture and it's easy for me to understand, not because it's simple, but because it's just such a repeated pattern of behavior in some sense. But still, I cannot really wrap my hand around like the why. Is there any, you know, we talk about natural resources and stuff, but there doesn't seem to be anything really like pointing, like there's not a one thing that we can say like oil or something, for example, that would explain some part of it. Is there anything to your understanding, or is it really just a, you know, play of powers of spheres of influence and stuff like that?
well, you know, it's a real conflict. So I will say that, right, there are these groups that are committing violence against people, and it's pretty bad. I mean, they're not, they're very violent, and they're trying to control, you know, villages and things like that. So it's a serious problem, and I think that really, you know, gets at some of the hardest things that, you know, I think especially for Americans, US residents, it's, you know, I think a lot of people in the US want to believe that the US can be a force for good in the world. There, you know, I even had a debate with a colleague over at Human Rights Watch about, well, you know, at least the US is doing some sort of training, you know, in human rights, and the military is far respecting human rights in a way that's, you know, much more than these, you know, the Burkina Faso military or the Malian military. And I think, you know, I was reading recently Talal Assad, who's a theorist who writes about the, you know, the kind of artificial, the way that the US has created a division between like morally good and morally evil ways of killing, right? And that's beset with contradictions. There's no way of kind of squaring like, you know, our way is the good way of killing, right? And those terrorists, theirs is the evil way of killing. And Assad is basically saying, you know, it's one and the same thing. What makes the US and the modern state stand out, he says, you know, the modern state institutions stand out, is its ability to pair the violence with discourses of compassion and humanitarianism, right? So it's really tricky to disentangle, you know, the kind of like these kind of ideas about responsibility to protect and, you know, shouldn't the military be there to, you know, kind of protect people, and yet, you know, I think what it comes down to is if you're protecting people at the barrel of a gun, then it's not really protection, really. It's something else. And so but I do think that those are really complicated questions, and yeah, but right. But so basically I'm saying like the US is kind of implicated in these processes of violence and spiraling the violence. but there's also ways in which people are talking about the US as kind of like, you know, able to do the opposite. And so I think it's up to us to kind of call it out when it's talk rather than action, you know, and when the words sound good, but the actions show otherwise.
Yes, benevolent hegemony is one of our issues that we talk about all the time. This sort of ideological tool that the US uses as a construction of the good guy at the end of the barrel of a gun. Tyler, do you have a question?
Hi, yeah. My question is actually sort of on this thread, and it's sort of about the general narrative of terrorism. I think there's this sort of monopoly on justified violence, and who gets to decide what that is. And it is Western powers usually. And I wonder sometimes if it's even a useful framework. I think we see it in the ways that like the US population is controlled by policing forces, and probably in other countries too, and in the way that the US determines what is justified violence and unjustified violence all over the world. And I find myself wondering if that's even a good, I feel like terrorism isn't even a good framework to think about these things, because there's people that are armed for all sorts of reasons. Absolutely. With all sorts of life experiences. And I'm sort of curious what your thoughts on that are, and if there is a way to sort of shift rhetoric or discussion about this type of stuff away from the, oh, well, they're terrorists.
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of a basic anthropological insight about terrorists and criminals for that matter, is that those kinds of labels are political, and that, you know, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, or, you know, you could call them political insurgents or criminals, or, you know, there's depending on who's doing the labeling. So the word terrorist is one that in some ways we're kind of like reproducing the normative framework of looking at things if we're using the word terrorist at all. But then the question is, well, how do you talk about this without that word? And it does become really tricky, because, you know, there's just so many. I mean, part of what Cost of War struggles with is we want to like make our research really publicly accessible, and we want to shift the public debate. And so we have to use the terms that are recognizable to people. But then what, you know, so how do you kind of like navigate that line, you know? And a lot of times I use the word militants because I feel like it's you know, or people who are using terror tactics, people who are using tactics of you know, committing violent attacks, things like that. But yeah, it's a really great question.
Thanks.
Thank you, Tyler. Camilla.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I don't even know like how to ask it. I don't exactly what I'm thinking, but like it's kind of broad. But I'm just thinking about rural areas and like life in like villages, and you said like villages, hamlets, these kinds of things. And I think like around, I don't know, a lot of like the rural life is basically dying. Do you see a future for traditional rural life in the countries that you've studied, and how can it be possible? Or do you think it's something doomed to be like died out as people fight over land and resources?
That's a big question. I don't know. I really don't know. I'm not the one to speak to that. But I will say that, you know, when you go to a country like Burkina Faso, the capital Ouagadougou is urban, and there are a couple more urban centers but most of the country is living in a very rural way of life. So it's hard to imagine that shifting in a really massive way in the near-term future.
Okay, well, with an eye to the clock and so very grateful, I think we will wrap it up here. If there doesn't appear to be any more questions, so effusive thank yous to you, Dr. Savell. It was absolutely wonderful to hear about your work in Burkina Faso, and so interesting, and an area that we just don't hear enough about. So this is sort of at the heart of what Brown Wall Watch tries to do, and we really appreciate you coming and sharing information in this research.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's great to talk to you all, and congratulations on all the great work you all do. I keep in touch about it a little bit, and it's a fantastic group, and really you deserve a lot of congratulations for all your hard work and your activism. So happy to talk.
Thank you. Yes, and we same goes. We do love the Cost of War program, and it's very important for the work we do here. I've told you that many times, but we continue to depend on the scholarship produced out of the Cost of War program in the activist community. So, thank you, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Right. Take care. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.